Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Popper Theater here in Schoenberg Hall at the UCLA Herb Alpert School of Music. My name is Travis Cross. I am a professor in the music department, vice chair and associate dean for academic mentoring and opportunity, and we are happy to welcome you here for this talk in our music and medicine series with Carolyn Katzen. The mastermind behind the series and the medical brains in the operation is Dr. Malcolm Taw. We'd like to welcome him to introduce our speaker. Doctor.
Thanks so much for that kind introduction. And thank you once again to Travis Cross, Associate Dean for the School of Music, as well as Dean Judy Smith for their kind collaboration in setting up this music and medicine series. And this morning, it is my privilege to introduce our speaker, Carolyn Katzen, who is a UCLA nutritionist and health educator. She is also an integrative oncology specialist at the UCLA Sims-Mann Center. And not only is she an excellent healthcare practitioner, but she has a deep passion for music, having sung at the London Philharmonic Choir at Albert Hall. And I understand as well that her father was a concert pianist. So she has a lot to share with us, a lot of insight and wisdom. And let's go ahead and give Carolyn Katzen a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, I'm very excited to be here today and to talk to you about nutrition and to focus it a little bit on you as musicians and why nutrition can be so important for your own instrument. So if we take a look at some key components for healthy nutrition, hydration is of course very important, protein, and the fuel that we use. And recently we have been learning a lot about what's called the microbiome, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit in depth about that soon. And then, of course, we're each individual, and we all have our own stories, our own health stories. And there is a government, My Family Health Portrait, which is quite a useful tool, which prior to any family gathering might be useful to look at. Sometimes, of course, you don't know what's going on in your family, but it's helpful to know if there have been some particular conditions to look out for. There are also some particular numbers that are valuable for you to know about yourself. It's helpful to know about how you handle glucose, for example. What is your fasting glucose level? If it is on the higher side, you may also want to look at your A1C. Vitamin D, that's a test that's increasingly being looked at, especially for cancer patients. And also how your weight and height, not just your height, but your weight and neck measurement has changed. So if we look at musicians, what specific conditions or health considerations should we think about? Well, obviously sensual acuity is very important. How you hear, how you touch, visual, lung capacity, and of course the ability to stand or sit for long durations. These are things that are topics of interest, bless you. And then in terms of health challenges, there are some specific things that may be related to those things, and we can kind of go through those and see how nutrition can play a role there. So first of all, let's think about sensual acuity in nutrition. Of course, taste, how we taste things, is one of the senses that we're most aware of. And of course, if you're interested in nutrition, you care about what you taste. We often say there are people who live to eat or eat to live. And if you enjoy taste and you feel and you taste things, then you're obviously somebody who's going to be particularly interested in that. There are people who are what we call super tasters. And these are people who actually notice flavors particularly. And some thought-provoking work has been done recently on people who actually don't taste very well. And those are the people that seem to be more likely to become obese, which is interesting because maybe they're having to eat more food to get a sense of taste. Vision, of course, is also very important because if you can't read music or if you can't see what you're doing, it's much more challenging. And there's an interesting combination of the two programs that have been shown with research to be providing the longest, healthiest lives, one of which is the Mediterranean diet, and I'll show you a little bit more about that in the future, in a moment, and then the DASH diet. So the DASH diet is basically a low sodium diet, and the Mediterranean diet is full of colorful vegetables and is not necessarily low in fat. It actually is relatively high, but fats that come from olives and almonds and fish. And there's a combination of both of these called the MIND diet, which is being looked at and specifically for cognitive and other sensual acuity. So the key features of the Mediterranean diet, it's actually interesting to look at the original program. It was prior to 1960, so there was no processed foods, no fast foods. And it came from the island of Crete, where they can grow quite a lot of things, and of course they eat fish, but most of the people are relatively poor. And so it's a lot of variability in as much as they have different types of fasts that are associated with the Greek Orthodox Church. And it's when we think about the Mediterranean diet, we tend to think of eating the same thing every day. But actually, one of the features of the Mediterranean diet is what you might call intermittent fasting, is a lot of variety. In terms of sensual acuity, another nutrient or part of a diet that's very important is zinc. And zinc is a trace element. Actually, zinc research was what drew me to UCLA from England, where I'm originally from. And Dr. Kurt Eckert at the School of Public Health studied zinc research, and he was my advisor. And so I'm particularly interested in zinc. But zinc is very important as almost like a copy editor for the genes. We talk about zinc fingers, which are regions of the genome, but actually zinc is very important in a lot of health issues. So moving down to the lungs, respiratory health, lung capacity, the whole upper respiratory tract is extremely important. And the airways and also the fluidity of the lungs depend on a substance called mucus or mucin, and this is where there's a lot of interaction with the outside world. So basically the mucin contains a lot of glycoproteins, and this is an area of a lot of interest in terms of whether there's an overreaction to a foreign substance or less of a reaction. And of course, many molds and things like that have toxins, and those glycoproteins may overreact to those. So this is a whole area of interesting research going on. If we look at posture, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the Alexander technique. That's actually a way of standing, which is kind of efficient, which was developed by an Australian singer, I believe, somebody who had to stand for long periods. And so the way we stand or how we hold ourselves can make a big difference in terms of fatigue and how your performance is, but also obviously if you have to sit. Bone health and weight-bearing exercises, vitamin D plays an important role here too. And I do encourage you to find out what your vitamin D level is. Most people don't know it, and once you find out, you can see some people actually have single-digit vitamin D levels, which is really, really low, and they need to know that and have it brought up in probably at pharmaceutical levels. Reflux or GERD can play a role in upper respiratory tract health too. Sometimes people think that they have a cough and that's what's going on, or maybe their voice is changing, and often it's actually in relation to reflux, which can happen sometimes from the way we eat, the speed that we eat. If you eat in a very irregular pattern, that can be a problem. And so these are foods that may trigger a worsening of reflux. Unfortunately, they're all the foods that most of us like, so it's really hard to say just don't eat any of them, but sometimes just modifying them. And sometimes modifying the position that you're eating in too. So if most of us might say, okay, I'm tired, had a long day, I'll sit down in front of the TV and we're sort of crunched over like this, and then we eat these types of foods, and then it's more likely to have reflux than if we're sitting upright, and then maybe after the meal walking around a little bit. Different musculoskeletal conditions, this kind of covers everything from joint pains to, I was talking to a musician recently who was talking about how his shoulder had been giving him a lot of problems and how challenging that was because he's a violinist, so it was very difficult. So all of these things, some of anything that ends itis means it's inflamed or has, and chronic inflammation is associated with a lot of problems in health problems. So these are just some ideas that you might want to try to minimize your risk of chronic inflammation. There's a particular spice called curcumin, which is part of turmeric. Turmeric is a very common part of Asian dishes and especially part of curry powder. And if you have something like curcumin on a regular basis, that can also be helpful. But I will talk to you a little bit more about curcumin in a moment. We also should avoid trans fats. So trans fats are naturally present in very tiny quantities. However, in the food industry, about 30, 40 years ago, this is one of the sort of embarrassments about nutrition. Sometimes we completely come back and say what we thought was good was not good. People used to think that margarine was good for you, and now, of course, we recognize that it's actually very harmful because it's high in trans fats. And unfortunately, labeling of trans fats can be very confusing because the food industry is allowed to say 0 trans fats if they have as much as 0.9 grams per serving on average. So if you've only got something like potato chips and the serving is probably there's 4 or 5 servings in the bag, and they may say no trans fats, but actually it may well have up as much as 4 or 5 grams, which doesn't sound like much, but if you're having this constantly, that can be irritating and cause chronic inflammation. So curcumin is actually the active principle in the culinary spice turmeric. It does have both anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties, and some people have used it traditionally to help with pain relief and to support immune functioning. It isn't very well absorbed in the GI tract. And one of the things I would caution you about is that there's a number of supplements out there with curcumin that have irritants in them. And basically the idea of the stomach irritants or the intestinal irritants such as black pepper is that they irritate the digestive tract so you absorb more curcumin. But that's not a great way to be going because you're basically taking the curcumin to minimize irritation. And then if you have irritants in there at the same time, it's kind of fighting against itself. Vitamin D, as I mentioned before, is very important for you to know about. This is a newer understanding that vitamin D plays a big role in our immune system. It plays a big role, of course, in calcium uptake. It may play a role in sensitivity of insulin and as well as mood and cognition. I think most of us know about how if what they call seasonal affective disorders. They're people who feel much better when they're around sunlight. They feel much better when they're in daylight. I'm definitely one of those people. I would not do well in Seattle. I don't like it where it's all gray and dark. And so that's really related to vitamin D. That vitamin D plays a role in that too, in your mood. These are some food sources of vitamin D, and as you can see, really there are not many foods that naturally contain much vitamin D. If you eat salmon on a regular basis, you're probably getting some there, but for many of us now, we actually, if you have low vitamin D levels, you may need to be taking a supplement on a regular basis. But before taking the supplements, you first of all need to know what your level is. So another thing that may be relevant to you as musicians is how you handle stress. So if there are people who handle stress with headaches, sometimes the headaches come from basically shrugging your shoulders up or being very tense and having a lot of tense muscles. Some of the foods that may help with that are magnesium rich. So magnesium is found in dark green leafy vegetables, in many nuts, especially walnuts, which are also a rich source of omega-3, which is a precursor to anti-inflammatory messengers. Salmon also is and other seafood are magnesium rich. Other triggers of headache could be, everybody's very unique with this, but there are things called tyramines which can trigger headaches. They're kind of false neurotransmitters, and there are certain foods that are very high in tyramines. Usually gravies, actually aged cheeses, I didn't write that there, but that's another thing. Processed meats, these things can sometimes trigger a headache in somebody who's sensitive to tyramines. If you have a lot of coffee on a regular basis, you may also find that maybe on a Saturday, if you're drinking coffee in the office and then you go home and you don't have as much coffee, always having a headache on a Saturday can be from caffeine withdrawal. So that basically means that if you have a certain level of caffeine and then you don't have it, it can cause a very intense headache. Some artificial sweeteners have been associated with some migraine headaches with people too, aspartame being one of them. But that's usually when they're had on an empty stomach without food. Fatigue, one way you might want to try to override fatigue is with caffeine. That is one of the sort of common stimulants around the world, and it blocks adenosine receptors. And there are people who can actually tolerate huge quantities of caffeine without feeling anything at all. On the other hand, those are the people that sometimes if they stop drinking coffee, they can still get that headache. But for many people, we have to be very careful how much you have, because it can actually have a really toxic effect on the body. There are many other stimulants in nature. Cocoa powder, of course, has some similar stimulants. The other thing about stimulants are that if you have them during the day, and say caffeine takes 3 to 6 hours half-life, so that would be 12 hours total in the body. So actually you could be having caffeine that's keeping you awake at night because you're still having that stimulant effect. If you do have insomnia, and after all, insomnia is very common, especially in the way that we live now on a sort of 24/7 cycle, one of the things I think is very important to know is that it's during the night that your body does most of its repair work. So if you don't get peaceful rest at night, your body's not going to be able to repair itself as effectively. So I often say to people, even if you're not sleeping, at least be peaceful and rest and do maybe some counting, some meditation, something to just help you to be more peace and to allow your body to regenerate itself. I mentioned the microbiome before, and the microbiome is basically the environment or the ecosystem of the microbes that live in and on us. I recently heard a very thought-provoking number. There was a wonderful researcher who's now at UC San Diego called Rob Taylor from New Zealand, and he has an excellent TED Talk which you can watch on YouTube about the microbiome. But he stood there and he says, we're only 43% human, which is quite thought-provoking. He is in charge of the Human Microbiome Project, so he knows from what he's speaking. So I put this sort of diagram together basically to say that we are focusing now more and more on the health of the microbiome. Because if there are more microbes than our own cells, we need to make sure that they are in a healthy balance and that that ecosystem is healthy. So moving food from one end of our bodies to the other, if it moves too fast, we get diarrhea. If it moves too slowly, we have constipation. And these are just some suggestions for diarrhea. Some people are feeling diarrhea because we have a lot of neurotransmitters that line the digestive tract too. And sometimes if you're anxious or nervous, things can move through you fast because your neurotransmitters are signaling that. It really depends on many, many different things. You may have to pace out how you eat if you won't have time to go to the bathroom because you're performing, say. There's ways to think about it. And some people have diarrhea because they're eating a lot of foods that help with constipation, or vice versa. So these are foods that help you with constipation, but if you're eating a lot of dried fruits, for example, you may find you have diarrhea, but that's probably because you were eating these foods unwittingly. And this is a diagram from Nature recently talking about how this gut-brain axis, where at UCLA we're actually doing a lot of research on this. UCLA is one of the leading research centers for whether it is actually the stress neurotransmitter triggers that begin in the brain that are then changing the microbiome, or vice versa. And I don't know that anybody really knows for sure which starts which, but there's a very strong interaction between what goes on in the digestive tract and what is going on in our brains. And for example, there's a lot of serotonin receptors in the digestive tract, and of course serotonin in the brain, the immune system, basing a lot on that mucin connection, how the interaction across the digestive tract walls, and the different microbes, which ones thrive and which ones are maybe doing too well. So for example, you may have some things like yeast that overgrow if you have a lot of antibiotics, or you've been having a lot of sweet, simple carbohydrates, or maybe even living in an environment where there are a lot of molds. So keeping our digestive tract happy is an important part of our overall health, much more important than I think we've ever understood before. So probiotics are basically living microorganisms that, when administered in adequate amounts, confer a health benefit on the host. That is a sort of definition that was recently given by the World Gastroenterological Organization. But the whole field of what you might call pharmabiotics is a very active field, because it's not really a food and it's not really a pharmaceutical, but they are having a pharmaceutical effect. So there is a lot of interest in this area, but there's also a lot of hype. So of course, traditionally, many people have eaten fermented foods of all sorts. And we usually recommend continuing to eat those foods, because that's the best way to be supporting the ecosystem within you. However, just taking probiotics as supplements may or may not be helpful in the long term. You may need to take them for longer periods of time, and we also need what are called prebiotics as well. So prebiotics are essentially the types of nutrients that the probiotics thrive on. So they are usually loosely called dietary fiber, but prebiotics that are specifically targeted for probiotic health are now being used a lot in the food industry, things like inulin. Inulin may also be very gassy, however, because sometimes if you disturb the digestive tract ecosystem, you can get a lot of gas and discomfort. And there are programs now. You can get an app on your phone, several apps from the University of Monash in Australia, where they've been looking at what are called FODMAP-free diets, or low FODMAP diets, because these are gassy and they can cause a lot of discomfort. And some people find just cutting some of these foods out of their diet can help a lot with symptoms such as irritable bowel syndromes. Fermented food, as I mentioned, are basically ways prior to refrigeration. This is the predominant way that we stored foods, and beverages, of course, because wines and liqueurs, well, wine specifically is fermented, and beers. But there are also foods that we eat too. So I usually recommend that people include some things that maybe are more traditional for your family, where your family came from. For example, if you come from Asia, you might want to try more things like tempeh or kimchi. Or if you come from Eastern Europe, maybe more sauerkraut. Things that basically were part of what your family have thrived on. And there are also some supplements of powdered fermented papaya and fermented wheat germ, which interestingly can be taken by they've been taken by people whose immune systems are a little bit low in activity, and they have both pro- and antioxidant activity and may be helpful. So the fiber or prebiotics that we have, one of the roles that it plays is to basically slow down the transport of carbohydrates, particularly simple carbohydrates, so that what you get is a result of glycemic, meaning sugar, and emic, blood, how you get a slightly smoothed out response in the bloodstream. And we talk about glycemic load. Sometimes people talk about glycemic index. Glycemic index is an individual food, and since we normally eat combinations of foods, we think about it more as glycemic load. And because a low glycemic load is a diet that's rich in plant-based foods, such as beans, vegetables, and different plant-based diets, and that tends to have a better overall effect on your glucose and insulin response. I wanted to talk a little bit about hydration. Right in the beginning when I talked about what's really important to hydration, protein, and fuel with the microbiome. So hydration is also really important. I think depending on how much you sweat and how active you are, and also how many vegetables and fruits you eat. I have another colleague here in the School of Public Health, Bill McCarthy, who always says that you should eat your water. He doesn't like people drinking water with their meals. He says if you drink too much water, you don't want to eat your water. I'm not sure that that has been proven, but it's certainly true that when you eat a lot of vegetables, or if you drink vegetable juices with the whole vegetables in there, you probably don't need to drink as much liquids. But one of the questions that I get asked a lot about is, what about alkaline water? I don't know, I guess they're very good at marketing these machines. So I always include a couple of slides that really talks about this. Mainly, the way we normalize pH or acid and base in our bodies is with breath. And that's one of the main reasons why it's so important to do deep breathing, I think because I sang for much of my life, I happen to have pretty good lung capacity, but it is a use it or lose it thing. The more you breathe, the better your lung capacity is. And then, of course, you're normalizing your pH simply by doing that. But, water can be helpful too, and sometimes when I see patients who are going through a lot of chemotherapy and radiation, for example, where there is a lot of cellular turnover, I may suggest to them that if they want to have a small amount of the alkaline water, they can. But I don't recommend people drink alkaline water throughout the day, because that may be adding stress to your normal processes. So these are just foods. It's not like, okay, if I eat fish, it's got to be always healthy for me. Some of these things have a slightly different overall effect on the body. I also just wanted to talk a little bit more about the processing of foods and how that affects how we absorb foods, and how this was actually prior to the idea of glycemic load. It was published in Lancet in 1997. The same amount, 35 grams of carbohydrate, in a different processing form. So for example, a fresh apple had a very different response than apple juice, because of course apple juice is processed, it's heated, and it has no fiber in it, whatever. But applesauce was somewhere in the middle. And I think it's important to think about the fruits and vegetables that you're having, to have them as much as possible in an unprocessed manner. Also, sugar is a main fuel. As of next year, the FTC, I think it is actually, not so much the FDA, is going to require that added sugars is listed separately on the label. And this is going to be quite helpful, because sometimes things look as if they have a lot of carbohydrate, but you don't know how much of it is from added sugars or how much of it is naturally present in the plant. And we do consume a huge amount of sugar in this country. The other thing that I think is important is knowing how we, because of using the use of sweeteners, how our taste buds have become blunted to sweetness. Natural sugars, which are above sucrose and fructose, are really not tremendously sweet. But if you look at things like aspartame or saccharin or sucralose, Splenda is 600 times as sweet. So what happens is our taste buds get blunted to this sweetness, and we're probably having distorted effects, and maybe even in the microbiome from that. This is from the government, basically, and they recommend reducing added sugars. And of course, it all kind of makes sense, but it's difficult to do sometimes. So with all of that in mind, what should you be eating? Everybody's different. We all need to know what are our sensitivities, what are our requirements, as much as possible, know as much as you can about that. Over the years, I've come up with an idea of what I try to tell a story about food, and what I call the 3 A's, which is antioxidants, anti-inflammatories, and anti-carcinogens. And the idea being that if you eat foods that are delicious and healthy, you will be getting all 3 of those things. But the idea being that they're all important in their own way. Of course, sometimes it's important to recognize if you're taking any medications to be sure that there aren't foods that might interfere with the medication's clearance or activity. A concept that I also think is very important to be aware of is hormesis. Hormesis is essentially a way of saying it's the dose that counts. And one of the things that people think of is if a little is good, a lot must be better. And what we've learned is that that really isn't true. There are certain foods and certain nutrients and certain bioactives or substances that we are exposed to in the environment that in the beginning we can tolerate and have no effect one way or another. Example would be mercury. So for example, you can have a small amount of mercury and it's not going to harm you. If you ate sushi 3 or 4 times a week, it probably would give you a problem because your mercury level would start to rise. But then there are other components. Let's say curcumin as an example, which a small amount of it probably does nothing. You take a little bit more and it actually has some benefit. But if you take too much, then it also starts to have some harm. So everything has this dose that counts or hormetic effect. And I think it's an important concept when we think about putting together a lot of bioactives, because you may or may not be helping yourself when you do that. And that comes along to where it's helpful to ask for expert advice. Many pharmacists are taught a topic called pharmacognosy, and pharmacognosy is really looking at bioactives and how they all can combine together. Another concept is how we are all genetically different. I touched on this a little bit earlier with caffeine, how there are some people who are very on super tasters, for example. These are people who just have different ways of processing different bioactives. And there are also some genetic factors that may result in whether we're assuming that pretty much everybody is in the bell curve, but sometimes we're not. Sometimes that's partly why they have a concept called number needed to treat, meaning how many people actually have to take a product to have enough people that actually have benefit. And it's quite amazing how a lot of medications have no benefit because maybe more people are either not metabolizing it at all, or they're metabolizing it so fast it doesn't have a benefit. And then you add in a lot of bioactives, being, say, dietary supplements, you don't know how it's going to turn out. So the main reason why I'm mentioning this is because I think in today's world with so many supplements available, we have to just be conscious of what we're doing to make sure that you're supporting your health, not necessarily adding to a bioactive load. So I'll just touch a little bit on what I mean by these 3 A's. Because that is kind of how I try to tell the story of nutrition and how to tell the story of how to be in your optimal health. Because I think for most of us, that's what we're really looking for. We want to be as healthy as we can be going forward. So the antioxidants basically are what are naturally present in many, many foods, and also, of course, in our bodies. We have many antioxidant molecules. And these prevent the damage that possibly could happen from free radicals that were not quenched or controlled. Anti-inflammatories, a simple way of thinking about that is if cells divide faster than they normally might, or if they're recycling themselves faster than they normally might, they may make mistakes. And an anti-carcinogen is something that if a mistake was made, then hopefully it would be able to clear it away and process it. And the good thing is that lots of foods contain all three. And sometimes we need more antioxidants. For example, if you're having a number of scans, if you're perhaps flying over the pole to Europe a lot, there's a lot of natural radiation that way. And then you'd want to have foods that had more antioxidants. Oxidative stress is basically a situation where we don't have the load or the requirement for antioxidants is not met. And then if you're having continual challenge, you can have this dysregulation or chronic oxidative stress situation. And that has a lot of deleterious effects, including oxidation or peroxidation of both fats and other damage that may happen to DNA. So we don't want that. Basically, these are some foods that are rich in antioxidants. Most of them in the plant world have colorings or flavonoids, and those are sort of almost like a measure of how much potential antioxidant activity is in these. And there are lots and lots in different foods that have benefits for humans. However, we don't want to overdo supplements of antioxidants because sometimes that can dysregulate the oxidative and antioxidative processing. If you wanted to boost your antioxidant intake, here are some foods that are rich in natural flavonoids. Of course, a little red wine with your meal, or some berries afterwards. That's kind of a nice way to do it that tastes good too. Anti-inflammatories, sometimes if people have chronic viral conditions or if they have any autoimmune condition where there's a lot of itises going on, then we want to focus a little bit more on anti-inflammatories. And this basically is showing a similar thing, like if there's an imbalance, it can affect your risk of cancers. Certain cancers can be increased if there's a chronic inflammatory condition. Foods that contain anti-inflammatory, either messengers or supportive of anti-inflammatory proteins are both omega-3s, and then also naturally present in the plant world are natural aspirin-like substances or salicylates. And going back to that mucin lining, mucin is involved with a lot of glycoproteins, many of which are salicylic acid-like substances. COX-2 is a pro-inflammatory protein, and so COX-2 inhibitors or COX-1 and 2 inhibitors include green tea, cocoa, and red wine. So coming back to those flavonoids again. This is also looking at a ratio of different types of fats and fatty acids. Sometimes people will say, well, you know, a low-fat diet would be helpful. It's actually not to do with the fat so much as the type of fat. So what we always want to be doing is getting sufficient omega-3s, because the omega-3s are precursors to anti-inflammatory messengers in the body. And most of the anti-inflammatory omega-3s come from fish, but not all. The alpha-linolenic acid is present in many, many different plants, including the grass that animals graze on. So grass-fed beef tends to have more omega-3 in it than the type of beef that has been fed corn or other grains which are richer in omega-6, which is also a precursor for some inflammatory substances. Anti-carcinogens, which is the third A, those are important for people who may have been exposed to different possible carcinogens, or if you have a family history, or you're just wanting to eat in a particularly healthy way. And most of these are bioactives or present in foods that prevent the damage from DNA and allow time for the cells to be either recycled or to have what's called programmed cell death or apoptosis. And these are foods that are found in many different, I usually recommend for people to have 1 or 2 of the garlic family or 1 or 2 of the cabbage family on a daily basis, because that will support your own body's capacity to reprocess and to make sure that it's screening and preventing these cells from continuing to go forward. And so you can see here there's a lot of different foods that are healthy and have a lot of different benefits for us. The allium family, the garlic, onion, leeks, chives, all of these have sulfur types of compounds that are natural defenses. They have some antiseptic. They are good for the whole body, including our microbiome. The brassica or cruciferous family or cabbage family, these are also very healthy for us, and there's a lot of different. I think that kale is kind of out of fashion now, and the latest fashion one is Brussels sprouts. But maybe we'll just sort of go through the whole cabbage family and get the vegetable of the year. So if we look at all those different vegetables, and we look at some berries and things like that, and we look at the 3 A's, then you can see that if you're eating a diet that contains those 3 A's, and you're getting 1 or 2 examples of each of them on a daily basis, it will support your microbiome, and it will support your overall health. And that will help you because you'll also be doing something in a very proactive way. Often you would want to be adding these garlic families. Watercress is another of the vegetables that I think has tremendous possible history. Hippocrates was the father of nutritional medicine. He was the one who was quoted as saying, "Let medicine be your food, let food be your medicine." And the story is that his hospital was on the edge of a river, and the watercress was growing in the river, and the idea was that he was really talking about the watercress when he talked about let food be your medicine, let medicine be your food. There's a lot of research looking at different berries, and the berries, especially black raspberries, have kind of unique isothiocyanins and things that are basically with these flavonoids, these properties that are bioactive that can be very helpful in the body's recognizing when cells are not doing what they're supposed to do, or basically being in dysplasia. Another thing is not just recognizing these nutrients or these bioactives, saying, okay, how can I incorporate them into my life? What can I do that will help me do that? Some of it may be just cooking strategically or preparing food ahead. So maybe if you're going to be having a very busy series of events, maybe ahead of time preparing, chopping, freezing, making some broths, having things that you can then, instead of being, having to go to the drive-through, you actually have this at home. Some snack ideas, here's some ideas for some snacks. Nuts, especially lightly salted, mixed nuts, walnuts, Brazil nuts, pistachios, almonds, these are great. Dips, a good way, especially kids, they like to put fresh vegetables into dips. And some fruits and some hard-boiled eggs, you can keep those. Those are very easy snacks. This is kind of what a typical menu plan might look like. Salads with lots of vegetables, and you'll see that each of these meals and snacks has some fiber, and think that that fiber is feeding your microbiome and keeping it happy. Oh, I'm sorry, that got out of alignment here. So strategic nutrition, essentially what we're talking about is thinking ahead, trying to make sure that you get these 3 A's on a daily basis. Fish is a great source of omega-3s and vitamin D, especially the oilier fish like salmon. You do want to be cooking often with herbs and spices. These are very good because they traditionally have small quantities of beneficial bioactives that have been shown over centuries to be helpful for us. And I also think it's important to remember that food is how we communicate. Food is how we enjoy pleasure with people. And it's really not just about numbers. It's really about how we connect with people. And one thing you can think about is you want to prevent, protect, repair, and regenerate. And eat smart to provide yourself with those 3 A's. You try to eat quality food, locally grown if possible, and we haven't talked much about exercise and except for the benefits of breathing and everything. But of course it's important to be physically active. That's how it's everything, use it or lose it. And then, usually we talk about at the Simsman Center, Dr. Coscarelli talks a lot about a toolbox, how you have different tools in your toolbox. So when you're actually challenged by different situations, you have different choices. And nutrition is definitely one of the things that we should add to our toolbox. This is a quote that I always like to use because it's from Albert Einstein. There are only two ways to live your life. One is as though nothing is a miracle. The other is as if everything is a miracle. And I think that, I remember I went to speak at a conference in Turkey, and I was very nervous because I hadn't been there before. And when I got there, I was looked out of the hotel, and the next door hotel was called the Miracle Hotel. I said, okay, I felt good here. And this slide is actually in memory of one of my teachers, John Milner, who was head of cancer prevention and nutrition for the National Cancer Institute, and was the one who identified the importance of bioactives and how many were apparently exposed to some 23,000 on a daily basis. And he was sadly, he died before he could really spend more time on this research topic. So that's part of my honoring him, is to continue to talk about that and show the slide. So I think we have time for some questions, and of course, available. Ask me anything, hopefully. Yeah.
I often hear that dairy is the devil and sugar is the devil, and all these things should be avoided, including food. So, in every lecture I go to, I hear that it is recommended to eat those. So it gets really confusing.
Yeah, I get that. The question is about, how many people are avoiding sugar. I think the most common thing people will say to me, especially in the intake form, I've cut out red meat, dairy, and sugar, and caffeine. They cut all those things out, and that's actually pretty hard to do because there's not a lot left to eat if you do that. I think the sugar story is more related to the way it's delivered to your body, and which is why I talked a lot more about the glycemic load, and also knowing who you are. Like, there are some people who process sugar incredibly well, and they have a very good insulin response. Their fasting blood sugar level is low, and if they enjoy something sweet, I don't think there's any reason for them to avoid it. So it's a very personal thing. As far as dairy is concerned, that's an interesting topic. There's a lot going on which really relates to food trade, and most of it is opening up the market in China to dairy products that are coming from New Zealand and Australia, because Australia and New Zealand are some of the largest dairy producers in the world. And there's a lot of things that have been talked about which may or may not have a lot of value for everybody, but it is true that we are industrially raising dairy cows, and of course dairy, milk comes, some people think eggs come from the dairy, they don't, eggs are from chickens, but milk comes from cows, and then of course the milk is divided into different products from milk, so we get everything from butter to cheese, to yogurt, to a wide variety of different things. And there's about 80% of the protein in milk is in the form of casein, and then 20% is in the form of whey. And whey contains a peptide that is very supportive to immune health. So for most people, whey is actually of great benefit. Casein, the story is now related to a subparticle of casein that is more prevalent in industrialized countries and is possibly associated with chronic inflammation. So you will start to see a lot more milk that's actually targeting basically the Chinese population, but is also targeting everybody else, that is called A2 milk. So if you see A2 milk, that is actually a type of casein that may or may not be easier for the digestive tract. So some of this is coming from a better understanding of the microbiome. Some of it's coming also because we're getting a better understanding of these glycoproteins that make up the mucin, that line the digestive tract. And in older parlance, we would talk about a leaky gut syndrome, or we would talk about people who have chronic autoimmune conditions. And now we're starting to say, well, maybe it's because we've been having a lot of foods that the immune system is overreacting to. And now looking at that is why we're starting to say there may be some dairy products that are actually better for us. So there's a lot of discussion of casein is bad for you, but then if you look down and you subdivide it, it may come down to this A2 casein is actually, so look for A2 milk. And some people prefer goat and sheep's milks because these also are less allergenic. And then, so I mentioned the sugar and the dairy. Was there anything else you said there?
No, just
Okay.
mostly dairy
Yeah.
is what I was.
Yeah. So did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, good. Anyone else? Yeah.
What about the mercury in fish? Is there anything in the government that protects us from fish with mercury?
Wow. Well, I'm not even going to go to what the government's going to protect us because I think any of these protections are probably going to be taken away. But it's a great question about mercury in fish. There is a spreadsheet that that I give to patients, which goes through different fish and different mercury levels. In general, salmon is very low in mercury, unless they've been fed fish meal that comes from other fish that is higher in mercury. As I said before, we can tolerate very small quantities of mercury without there being any harm, but then it never has benefited or causes harm. Most of the larger fish, like tuna, especially the large tuna, it does contain mercury because big fish eat little fish and it goes up the food chain. So the physician that I've been working with for about 17 years was noticing, he started doing spot tests of mercury on his patients. And he noticed that when people ate sushi more than twice a week, their mercury levels were elevated. So he always tells people don't eat sushi more than once a week. I think if the foods, and it is mostly tuna that does have mercury, we usually recommend not more than once a week. And then, of course, there's fish like swordfish that are quite high, and I'd say not more than once every 3 months. I think it's not that we can't process different bioactives, whether they're toxic or not. It's just that we don't want to be piling on too many at one time. And people were taking fish oil, and unfortunately some of that fish oil was not screened for mercury. So it's worth spending money on getting the I think it's called molecular distillery. The molecular distillation is the way they describe the fact that they've actually screened it for mercury. So that's the best way to avoid it. But in terms of government regulation, I don't think you're going to get any. We haven't had much recently, and we're not going to get more in the future.
Where does sardines fit in there?
Well, that's a good question. Sardines are somewhere in the middle. It really depends where they're coming from. Sardines are basically small herrings, smelt. They're just local fish, and a lot of them are coming from coastal regions. And in many areas of the world, the coastal regions are relatively contaminated from poor regulation. So I think it depends on where they come from. And the reason salmon is a good fish is because it's unique in being spawned in fresh water, goes out to the ocean, which is salt water, then comes back to the fresh water to lay eggs and then die. So it's got this amazing metabolism that goes from both fresh to salt water, and that actually translates into great health for us too. You had a question, yes?
I have two questions. So one is related to probiotics.
Yes.
So like, unless you have a homemade sauerkraut or kimchi,
Right.
where you have natural fermentation. Everything that we buy in the supermarket is already sterilized and pasteurized food or yogurts, and all the probiotics are added after the sterilization. So I'm wondering about the efficiency
Right.
of these, but supplements that are added into our dairy products, so the dairy is not fermented
Right.
naturally. The probiotic is added after. So
I-
that's your
I think that's a very good point. Kefir has more probiotics than, say, yogurt, but you're absolutely right. In general, we pasteurize. Usually it's very short temperature, very high temperature for a short time, which has minimal effect. May just put some of these probiotics into a spore state, and then they will regenerate in our own bodies. The Dr. Knight, who, as I say, I really recommend the way he speaks, he's saying that many of the supplements that we're buying, and many of them that are patented, they actually have letters and numbers after them. So that's how you know that they actually have been clinically studied. But he was saying that most of them have been clinically studied for anti-inflammatory properties, and they're not necessarily, it means that they live well out of the body, but we don't know if they're necessarily going to be of great benefit to us or not. We don't know. So there's a lot we don't know about probiotics, but I think eating a diet that's basically relatively high in fiber and is relatively supportive to a healthy ecosystem within you, then you're probably going to be doing quite well. There is a company called Microbiome, or ubiome.com, that is quite interesting because they are doing crowd science, basically, of everybody sending in samples on a regular basis and then looking at the different subspecies, and you can compare how yours is compared to somebody on a different type of diet, somebody on antibiotics, and the more we do this, the more we'll learn. And that's what the Microbiome Project is doing too. We're having to crowd science everything because this is all new. We only learned how to actually even identify these species only about 5 years ago. So this is all very new. I think they're looking to end it. So I will be available if you want to ask any more questions, and you have my email. I think there's a handout there, and you feel free to reach out to me. And I do have a very limited private practice where I see anybody, and then here at UCLA I'm seeing cancer patients, and sometimes people who want to avoid cancer, not just have cancer. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much.